have this thing that's happening it's basically like if we have fire in a fire pit. We've all experienced that, right? We're outdoors or we're indoors and we have a fire going. That brings protection. It brings warmth. It brings a lot of things that could bring life in. And I think that in my idea is a healthy masculinity. And then we see these fires ripping and roaring through all places of the world, and they're devastating homes, they're devastating communities, they're tearing down forests. I mean, it is just destroying everything. And that to me is the idea that that's toxic masculinity. That's something that could have been good, but yet it went wrong, it came out sideways, and here we go. And it's ended up stealing and killing and destroying a lot of people and a lot of things around them through that process.
We're conditioned and programmed to think that certain things are okay even when they're not, just because we're male. Well, boys will be boys, you know, and girls are sugar and spice and everything nice, and guys are rough and tough, whatever that saying used to be when you were kids. But even from that time, we're conditioned to believe and to have these concepts that are wrong.
I come from a very broken home, a home with no mother in it, with no woman in it. So basically I was raised by wolves, you know, men who had no idea how to love a woman or how to treat a woman or how to honor women. If anything, it was the exact opposite.
The fallout of a toxic masculinity presence was in my home when I was a kid in elementary school. I had a stepdad at the time, and he went into this space where he was ready just to destroy our family and destroy my mom. And I remember the things he would say about her to me, and I remember the things he would say to her, and he was just super verbally abusive in this stuff. And I remember as a kid not understanding manhood fully, or not understanding what does it look like for a man to be in the house or a man to be a leader, but I knew that something wasn't right in that because it was devastating to us. And I remembered wondering, am I gonna be just like him?
For me, this whole respecting women and loving my wife and cherishing women around me is not natural.
Sigmund Freud had this idea that man exists to seek pleasure.
We now are clearly seeing women coming out and saying what's going on. If no one tells a story, if no one brings to light what's going on in the darkness, we'll never fix it.
There was another man named Viktor Frankl who was a Viennese psychologist. He said, I don't believe man exists to seek pleasure. I believe that man exists to find meaning in his life, and when he can't find meaning, he distracts himself with pleasure.
Sexual desire is normal. It's a human trait. It's a natural feeling. But just because you have a feeling doesn't mean you're supposed to exercise that in any way that you see fit.
Growing up, I had experienced a lot of emotional abuse, a lot of neglect, and there was some sexual abuse that had happened in my childhood. At 17, I moved to Las Vegas, Nevada. When I got there, I was living with my dad, who at this point in time, me and my dad did not have a healthy relationship. I was targeted by 3 different traffickers, and they started the grooming process, the first 2. And by the time the 3rd trafficker had come around, I was mentally in a place where I was very, very disconnected from my family.
So my trafficking was go to the strip, get the number, and if you don't get the quota, then you get beaten when you get home. That was always pretty common.
My trafficker became very violent with me very, very quickly. And over time, he had to become more and more violent to keep me around.
He waterboarded me, pistol whipped me, he played Russian roulette with me, he electrocuted me, he burned me with clothing irons, he beat me with oranges in a sock because somebody told him it wasn't gonna give me bruises, but it would hurt. He actually lacerated 2 of my organs that way. So he was very violent, and the fear of dying kept growing as the beatings got worse and worse, to the point where I just thought that was the way I was gonna die.
I was hospitalized for 4 weeks. I had 12 surgeries, and I was 3 hours from death. Human trafficking is an industry that is fueled by deception, by people who are unaware of what is going on, and many myths come with that.
We need to put words to the fact that there's something broken about our understanding and definition of masculinity and manhood. So for me, it was really important to come to terms with this fact that I was lying to myself, but I think what is even more foundational is the fact that we as men are being lied to. We're being lied to about what it means to be a man, but we're also being lied to about the impact and the consequences on women for our exploits and for our using women, whether we're paying for sex or not.
We're going to start at the root and we're going to build from there. Because I think that there's a lot of real essential sort of foundational knowledge that we need. We need to understand where this issue of sex trafficking and commercial sexual exploitation even comes from. And I think one of the challenging things is that it's invisible to a lot of us. But through my work on domestic violence, I came across this remarkable group of women down in Portland, Oregon, where I was at the time, who had founded an organization to help other women who wanted to get out of the life. And as I met these women, and as I heard their stories, it shifted the way that I understood the issue. Because although they were adults when I met them, for the most part, they entered into the commercial sex industry as teenagers. Most had experienced physical abuse, emotional abuse, neglect in the home. Home wasn't a safe place to be. And so what happens when home's not a safe place to be? You run from home, or you spend a great deal of time away from home, or you're taken from home and placed in foster care, where again, you may be both vulnerable to more abuse or exploitation, and vulnerable to exploitation by significantly older men, by pimps, who will use emotional manipulation, sexual, physical abuse to gain power and maintain control over young people without a lot of other life experience. And I'd like to start with just talking briefly about some statistical information. 89% of people in prostitution want to leave prostitution. When I start talking to people about prostitution, especially with sex buyers, when I'm working with them, it's the issue of choice. One of the ways that I like to get to that with the groups of sex buyers is I will point out to them that anything that we choose to do or don't do is a choice, and that we have to look at the conditions under which choices are made. I've got a bad choice and I've got a worse choice, so I think I'll take the bad choice.
They are there because someone else is using power control over them, or because of a lack of options that they have. And again, those bad paths, which one do I choose? 73%
of people in prostitution are physically assaulted. 53% report that they're raped during their time in prostitution. 75% have been homeless. 68% meet the criteria for PTSD. 48% use drugs. 52% use alcohol. It's at that point in a lot of presentations that I do that people think that they've got it and say, oh, so that explains it. They're using they're doing the prostitution in order to pay for the drugs, in order to pay for the alcohol. But that's putting the cart before the horse, because for most people in prostitution that I've known, it doesn't start with the drugs. It starts with the prostitution. You know, at the end of the night, somebody gives you a drink. I don't know about you, but I would say, do you have two? Can you make it a little something stronger? Not because I want to get high or because I want to get loose, but because the location of my trauma is in my body, and I want to numb out, I want to kill that pain, and I want to dissociate. This specific exercise is going to be much more about the continuum as the range of forms of sexual violence that somebody can experience. And it can be helpful breaking it into a continuum, because I think many times we think about just the most horrific and the most overt forms and don't see how they're connected to a lot of other forms of sexual violence as well. So if we're going to think of the sexual violence continuum as this range of behaviors going from pretty low-level stuff, things that we might not even normally think of as being violent, to very high-level stuff, what would be the highest level? What would be the worst form of sexual violence that you can think of?
Rape.
Certainly, we put rape very high on the continuum. Is there something worse than rape that we can think of?
Death.
Yeah, so sexualized murder. So way before we get to this level of sexual violence, though, we could look at low-level forms, and it's important to look at some of the lower-level forms of sexual violence and see how they're connected up to these larger levels. So if we think of things on the lowest end, are there forms of sexual violence you can think of that aren't physical, that maybe aren't even verbal? Leering.
Making inappropriate comments.
Absolutely. Do you think women in prostitution experience leering, being catcalled, inappropriate comments? Absolutely.
Our society has created a place for men to not have to take responsibility for their actions, whether that's a catcall or sexually assaulting someone, or being a trafficker to a sex trafficking victim.
And they especially experience the second form of sexual harassment. It's in Latin, and it's called quid pro quo sexual harassment. Anybody know what that means?
This for that.
Okay, this for that. This is the sexual harassment where it's the boss who says, if you sleep with me, you'll get a raise or you'll keep your job. It's the teacher, sleep with me, you'll get an A or you'll pass the class. And I would say to everybody here, what is prostitution if not quid pro quo sexual harassment?
Because I was trafficked in Las Vegas, there are many people who believe that prostitution is legal there. The buyers who had beat me, who have raped me, who had stole money from me, and then my trafficker beat me later for that. The buyers who were the most violent to me were the ones that believed prostitution was legal in Clark County. And I believed that they were as violent to me as they were because they thought it was okay, that they thought they were in an okay place where they were legally allowed to do this.
But we can talk about other forms of sexual assault. We can talk about force, coercion, pressure into sexual activity, threats we can put up there too. And I think what we miss when we get into those line drawing debates is what all of these things have in common. And they share a common foundation because the sexual violence continuum is rooted in sexual objectification. Right? In order to do violence to anybody, you need to objectify them, turn them into something different than you are. In order to do sexual violence, you need to sexually objectify them. And that's the thing that's in common. You're treating somebody as an object, whether you're leering at them, whether you're demanding sexual access through quid pro quo, you're pressuring or coercing them into sex, you're raping them, mutilating, or murdering them. Not to say that these things are equivalent. I mean, obviously they're not, but they are connected. And these lower level things have the power that they do because the higher level things are there as well. Over 70% of men who buy sex say they either agree or strongly agree with this statement, I want to stop buying sex.
As a trained therapist, one of the things I see all the time, and I know was true in my own life, is that pain that's not transformed becomes pain that's transmitted. Said in a simpler way, hurting people hurt people. I'm a licensed counselor, and I have been for about 25 years. I primarily work with men and couples that are experiencing some kind of sexual brokenness. How I got into that, quite accidentally, is that that's my own story. I was a licensed counselor for a couple of years when my own addiction and story kind of came to the surface. I was sexually abused around the age of 8. I had an uncle who was very sadistic and who abused myself and a number of my older siblings who have since corroborated this. And that uncle was involved in selling myself to male friends in the community to be involved with them sexually. But fast forward many, many years in the early 2000s, and I started having pretty surprising symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. So the pain that I was carrying around and the trauma and the survival coping strategies that had been part of my life just to make it through, I began to act out sexually in a very, very secretive way, basically looking for pornography everywhere I went. I believe the deepest longing in our heart as human beings is to be known. And so if I'm wanting someone to know me and love me, but I've committed to going through life with this wall of being somebody who I'm really not, then I can never really be loved for who I am. And I set up this vicious cycle of needing more of something outside of me to validate me. And sex becomes like the perfect thing for that. And in my life, the only thing that got between myself and the compulsive sexual behavior that I knew was, quote, wrong and that I didn't really want to be a part of was me coming to the end of myself and being caught. And when I was caught, I could no longer maintain this illusion. Whether or not I morally believed that it was right or wrong, I knew deep down that what I was doing was at someone's expense. It was an arrangement of, I'll give you what you want and you give me what I want. You want and need money for whatever reason, and what I want is sex or what sex represented. And in my case, I remember going to buy sex and thinking, I don't really want sex, I just want to be held, which again is that sense of I want to be soothed and comforted. And with my story of abuse, I had no idea how to get that on a healthy level.
One of the things that people want to jump to initially is, well, this must be an addictive behavior. It must be a compulsion. But in fact, it's not. It's really not. It's not about an addictive or compulsive behavior. For some, it is. But for most, it's much more about kind of gender socialization or the stuff that you've been wanting to talk about, the toxic masculinity stuff that is at the root of a lot of this.
Yeah, this idea of toxic masculinity is, I think it's newer for me. It's a buzzword that now I'm more aware of.
Toxic masculinity is a little confusing for me. I just call it fake masculinity, kind of counterfeit masculinity.
The basics are easily like strong. You have to be a strong man. You can't show emotions. You can't show weakness.
There's only one allowed emotion, and that's anger.
Man is hard-hearted, takes control.
There's no sadness. There's no fear. There's no empathy for what this woman or this person may be feeling.
Knows what he wants, doesn't look back, decides his future. But, you know, all these ideas that, you know, man's in control.
You have to be the breadwinner. Yeah, they're very basic. They've been since times and decades have been pretty similar.
Some of those characteristics can be really detrimental and destructive.
I was applauded and encouraged to have multiple women most of my life. And if I didn't, I was something less than what made my, people proud of me.
Now for boys and men, we get the message that we need to act like a man. And so there's a couple things going on when somebody tells us that, when somebody says act like a man. When I'm little 5-year-old Peter, and my father is looming over me, telling me, why don't you just act like a man? I'm learning a couple things. First of all, I'm learning that I'm doing it wrong. And secondly, I'm learning to associate a whole string of characteristics and qualities with what we might call, quote, real manhood. So if I was to ask you, is a real man expected to be strong or weak, what would you say?
Strong.
Strong.
Our society has made it very normal for men to seem like they need to bottle up their emotions, that they need to not cry, that they need to provide and protect, but not emotionally.
In reality, how many of us could meet this standard all the time? We're always strong, never have any emotions except for anger, pride, and horny, great at sports, never lose, never lost a fight, lots of sex and sex partners, we're big, independent. Quick show of hands, who meets that standard? It's a ridiculous question, right? Because none of us can measure up to that all the time. But I think it's kind of a dirty little secret of men that we spend a lot of time and energy pretending that we measure up to this. And a good way to understand why we do that is to take a look at some of the names that we might get called by our male peers if we're seen as outside this box, if we're not seen as strong but weak, or if we show our emotions, or if we're not interested in sex with girls. So what are some of the names that he might get called?
Well, I can remember, I wanted very much so to not have sex until I got married. I mean, they called me a queer.
Okay, so that's one thing.
Yep.
Call you a queer.
What are you, a queer? You never had sex, you must be gay.
Mm-hmm. Little girl.
A little girl, a pussy, gay, sissy, bitch. Right, and so are you noticing a pattern? What do these names have to do with? Being a girl or being a gay man? And so what does this tell us about the way a, quote, real man thinks about women and gay men?
In a negative.
Negative, that they're subordinate, that the worst thing that I could get called is to get called these names. And suppose I do get called these names. Suppose somebody says, Peter, you queer little girl, pussy, gay, sissy, punk bitch. Inside, I'm afraid that if I get put into outside this box, I'll be in a class with women and gay men, and it will make me vulnerable to other men's violence. Because in addition to the messages we get about having a lot of sex and a lot of sex partners, I think that there's a couple other messages that we get about how men are supposed to be sexually. One of them is that men are expected to be the initiators of sex. Would you agree with that? We learn that we're supposed to be the ones that push for sex. The second thing I think we learn is that we're supposed to know everything about sex before we're sexual. Would you agree with that too? You got to know what to do. And so if we've got to know what to do, and if we've got to be the ones that initiate it, where do we get that information? Where do we learn about sex and sexuality? And so what do you think? Where do boys learn about sex?
Pornography.
Okay, so learn about it from pornography. And where else?
And older boys.
Okay, older boys. So we learn about sex from porn and from our peers. If we take a look about where boys are learning about sex from, and if they're learning about sex from pornography, orgasm is an incredible behavioral reward for learning to treat a person as an object. It's not two people there. It's one person and an objectified image of another person. And so many boys have this experience again and again and again and again and again and again and again, and I can't even say that many agains, before they're with a real person in real time. And it gets in the way of their ability to connect with that real person in real time down the road. So these places, learning about sex from porn, learning about sex from the male peers, get in the way of us learning about sex from the partners that we're with eventually, right? And not imposing our ideas about what sex is about upon them. Not feeling like we've got to prove our manhood to ourselves or our buddies or anyone, but feeling comfortable and enough in our own skins where we can connect with other people. Can you see how this is related not just to pornography use, but to sex buying later on? Yeah.
When a kid is exposed to pornography at a very young age, they have not only the expectations of what sex should be like, but the expectations to have power over a female.
We need to be conscious. We need to be awake and conscious in our own lives.
So if we start to become aware of what we're doing, then the next step is to change it and to realize how it's affecting not only us, but society as a whole.
Surround yourself with men who are going to encourage you to be this version of man who you envision yourself being, and who are going to support you and help you. Don't be afraid to lose a friend or two, because you might have to. Stand on what you say, Be who you say you're gonna be, and let these guys see what that looks like. Because they're watching. More than they're listening, they're watching. So be who you say you're gonna be.
There's different ways that you can engage. It's one thing to do it in a training context. What's more difficult is doing it out in the world when it just comes up randomly. But being able to say something and to get the conversation started in a non-judgmental way, I think is a skill that we really need to work on.
There's an event that's taking place, there's something we're part of, our response is going to dictate the outcome. Is this outcome going to be a tragedy? Is this outcome going to be something that we've never experienced, that may be something healthy? We get a chance to change that. And by realizing that today is a start of something new, this moment is a start of something new. I don't have to be the guy that I once was 2 weeks ago. I don't have to be the guy I once was 2 years ago, 10 years ago. I don't have to do the same things that I've done in the past. This moment moving forward is literally my choice of how I'm gonna become and how do I want people to remember me? How do I want people to see me now? And what kind of legacy do I want to leave? Do I want to leave a story that's a tragedy, or do I want a story of hope and redemption and all these different attributes? Because I get a choice.